The islands of the Galapagos are famous for their unusual forms of wildlife, like the only seagoing lizards in the world, the marine iguanas. What is often overlooked is their importance to birds, especially to seabirds. The islands are an ocean nursery. Many of the seabirds of Galapagos are endemic species or subspecies that nest nowhere else in the world. The Galapagos, which lie on the equator, have two main seasons, with several months of transition between the cool and the hot weather. From January to June, it's very hot with some heavy rainfall. Then there's an overcast, humid, cool season known as the Garua, though its onset and duration are unpredictable. The Garua is the result of the arrival of cold water from the south. The seas cool down by only a few degrees, but it's enough to produce grey and dismal weather. In different ways, the ocean governs the nesting behaviour of most of the Galapagos birds, and certainly all the seabirds. The Galapagos lie in a part of the Pacific where the ocean currents are very complex. From July to December, the southeast trade winds drive the cold Peru current with its rich seabed upwellings northward. This cold water stream then turns west to join the south equatorial current and provides the Galapagos with comparatively chilly, food-rich waters. When the southeast trades slacken around November, a mass of warm water flows south and west, bringing rain and decreasing the amount of seafood available around the islands. When an extra powerful current known as El Niño persists, disaster can follow for Galapagos marine life, including seabirds. Sea conditions can vary from island to island. From July to October, the east-flowing Cromwell undercurrent brings some of the richest and coolest water to the most westerly islands. These variations in food supply and sea temperatures greatly influence when seabirds nest. The same species often differs in choice of breeding time from island to island. Blue-footed boobies fish close inshore. This feeding frenzy off the island of Hispaniola indicates that the boobies will probably be nesting there. On the more northerly islands, it's quite possible that the same species isn't breeding yet, if the sea conditions aren't right. In other parts of the tropical seas, the brown pelican's nesting period is seasonal. The Galapagos subspecies breeds at all times of the year, whenever the sea surface is rich with fish. A common noddy perched on its head scavenges fish scraps left by a pelican. Like almost all Galapagos seabirds, the pelican is an opportunist feeder and breeder. It builds a stick nest overlooking the ocean and lays 2 or 3 eggs. There are only a few Galapagos seabirds with a fixed breeding cycle. Each year, the waved albatrosses start to display in April as part of the pair formation for breeding the following year, and not as a prelude to mating. Almost the entire population of waved albatrosses, some 12,000 pairs, nest in just one place, the island of Hispaniola. The waved feather pattern gives the albatross its name. There are several reasons why the albatross has a more regular nesting schedule. It arrives on Hispaniola in early April. It needs a lot of time to mate and rear its single chick. By arriving in April, it avoids the 3 hottest months of the year. The timing also ensures that its chick hatches when food is likely to be most plentiful. The waved albatross ranges over vast areas of ocean to find food for its young. So the albatross is far less dependent upon the vagaries of the local currents. But it's by no means immune to them, and some years breeding fails completely. Waved albatrosses mate for life, and courtship is an intricate process. The pairs that arrive on Hispaniola have either bred together previously or formed their bond in the courtship period the year before. A green patch relieves the stark black lava flows of the island of Fernandina. Vegetation is rare on the shorelines of the Galapagos. These are mangroves, and they provide a nursery for the brown pelicans. Mangroves thrive in salt or brackish water. Red mangroves colonize the tide edge, and their stilt roots provide a buffer, preventing erosion of the coast. Their seeds are dispersed by the ocean currents. They're very tenacious and can even survive on apparently inhospitable volcanic shores. Throughout their range in the Galapagos, brown pelicans find mangroves ideal nesting sites. Inshore feeders, like pelicans, find it easier to locate food and expend less energy in catching it. In Galapagos, they generally breed more frequently than the pelagic species, which have to range far and wide in search of food. Galapagos pelicans lay 2 or 3 eggs and often rear them all, but many immature birds die because they have difficulty learning the technique of diving to catch fish. Pelicans are not immune to the disaster of a persistent El Niño year either, when the surge of warm water from the north takes away the food fish. The mangroves also provide a nursery for some of the land and shore birds. This yellow warbler is catching insects to take to its young in a mangrove bush. It removes a dropping from the nest. The marine environment influences the warbler's breeding behavior. Insects are most plentiful during the hot and rainy season. Nesting in the mangroves nearby, the yellow-crowned night heron feeds on crabs, centipedes and beetles. Because it catches insects for its young, it's less affected by the weather and the seas around the islands. This nest originally held 3 chicks. The weakest has been pushed out by its siblings and is dead. Siblicide, as it's called, ensures that only the strongest survive and are fed when food is short. The remaining 2 chicks are evenly matched in size and strength, but are still in competition with each other. As their name suggests, night herons are mainly nocturnal hunters. When the parent returns that night, only 1 chick is in the nest, but the second one soon re-emerges from the mangroves nearby. In most cases, 2 chicks do survive and are successfully reared. This nesting colony is on the slopes of the collapsed volcano Ecuador, at the northern end of the largest island, Isabella. Punta Vicente Roca is the site of one of the big blue-footed booby colonies. The birds have chosen their nesting site well. When the Cromwell current is flowing strongly, the seas off Isabella are full of fish. A male blue-footed booby flashes his bright blue feet as he lands. It's part of the display to attract a mate. In large colonies, there's almost continuous breeding, and pairs may nest every 7 to 9 months. But even here on Isabella, breeding success can be unpredictable. A male sky points to a female. It seems they both use the display of blue feet to assess the value of a potential mate. During courtship, symbolic nest building takes place, but taking a twig from a nearby nest provokes territorial aggression. So does landing too close to another bird's nest site. Another island and a different area of the ocean nursery. Bialowieza lies to the northeast of the archipelago. Its low scrub provides one of the main nesting areas for the great frigate bird. The male frigate's display is as unusual as the blue-footed boobies. It inflates its deep red throat pouch to attract passing females flying overhead. He perches in a bush and shakes his wings, displaying his swollen gular sac to attract maximum attention. When the male succeeds in attracting a mate, he goes into a frenzy. Raising a chick takes so long that frigates in the Galapagos breed less than once a year, and often only once every 2 years. They're largely dependent upon the ocean currents for food, picking fish from the surface of the sea. Like the other seabirds of the Galapagos, the flightless cormorant only breeds when the seas around its nesting islands bring abundant food within easy access. There are fewer than 1,000 nesting pairs in the world, and most are found around the Bolivar Channel between the islands of Isabella and Fernandina. The cormorants raise their young between March and December, with a peak period from April to June. That's when the cold Cromwell current carries most of the food on which the cormorants feed their young. Cormorants feed their chicks on partly digested fish, eels and octopus. Most pairs rear a brood of 1 or 2 chicks a year. They're excellent swimmers, but their wings are useless for flight. For the first 70 days, Both parents bring food or sit on the nest. Then the female leaves to find a second mate, and the male rears the chicks alone. This is unusual, since most seabirds mate for life. Even if a female doesn't lay again that season, she's ready to breed the next time. This wouldn't happen if she continued to raise her first brood, so it's a successful breeding strategy for a species unique to Galapagos. The juvenile birds are beginning to catch fish for themselves, although the parent still feeds them. The young cormorant begs for its food in the water, but the adult doesn't part with the fish so readily. The flightless cormorant has only been closely studied quite recently. This large, conspicuous and unusual bird was only discovered in 1896. At Punta Vicente Roca, the blue-footed boobies have successfully nested and reared young. This means the fish they dive for has remained plentiful and close inshore. There are 3 species of booby in the Galapagos, and each has a different feeding range, so they don't compete with each other. Like most of the seabirds that fish close to shore, the boobies lay 2 or 3 eggs and sometimes rear more than one chick. Galapagos hawks and the non-poisonous Galapagos snake are the main predators here. The snake is too small to harm the booby chicks, and the adult birds appear more curious than defensive about its presence. The wave albatrosses of Hispaniola arrived in April, laid most of their eggs in April and May, and hatched their chicks in late June and early July. These downy chicks will eventually grow into birds with a 2-meter wingspan. This chick is being fed on regurgitated fish oil, which the parent manufactures in a specially adapted part of the stomach while spending long periods away feeding at sea. Another pelagic or far-ranging ocean bird nests on Hispaniola. The red-billed tropic bird also nests on some of the other islands, wherever it can find a suitable sea cliff. The tropic bird, like the boobies, is a plunge diver, often dropping from 15 meters to catch fish and squid. It can't walk well on land and flies far away from the islands to make its catches. The tropic bird lacks the albatross's method of turning food into an oily substance and storing it, so it has to return frequently to feed its young. The tropic birds nest throughout the year on the islands of South Plaza and Daphne, with regular peaks of nesting. The limiting factor seems to be the availability of suitable nesting sites. Tropic birds lay a single, very large egg. The chick is brooded for at least 50 days, but once it's fledged, it leaves the nest for good to feed for itself and is completely independent. The tropic bird is not unique to the Galapagos. It's found throughout these latitudes, but it's one of the most striking and beautiful seabirds here. The season for rearing chicks in this unique ocean nursery never comes to an end. Somewhere within the 13 main islands and 110 smaller islets, some species will be found nesting throughout the year. There is one breeding cycle that has a predictable beginning and end, the waved albatrosses of Hispaniola. These large chicks have well-developed flight feathers, which they'll soon be exercising. The waved plumage has now almost completely replaced the early down covering. It's about 230 days since this young bird's parents mated and a single egg was laid. The waved albatrosses reared on Hispaniola this year won't return to breed for at least 3 years. During that time, they'll feed and travel long distances over the ocean. The powerful and changing currents of the sea affect everything which takes place in the seabird colonies, the ocean nursery of the Galapagos.
A pratin coal attempts to lure a predator away from its eggs by crouching on the ground with wings outstretched as though unable to fly. These sockeye salmon are nearing the end of their long journey upstream to reach the spawning grounds where they will lay their eggs, perhaps on the very stretch of river where they themselves grew up. How do these animals know how to behave? Do they have to learn these skills? Or is their behavior shaped by heredity, in other words, innate? The part these two influences, nature and nurture, play in behavior has fascinated man for centuries. Perhaps by looking at the behavior of other animals, we may learn more about ourselves. During the earliest stages of an animal's life, it's often the simplest behavior which is the most important for survival. A kangaroo leaves the womb while still an embryo and makes a remarkable journey up to its mother's pouch. Still blind and deaf, its bud-like front legs are strong enough to pull it upwards through the fur, guided by smell. There's no time for mistakes on this 3-minute journey. Once it reaches the pouch, it'll clamp onto a teat and remain suckling for the next 7 months. When an animal has to get it right first time, the behavior is usually innate. It works well provided circumstances do not change suddenly. Birth is a time when mistakes could be fatal. A newly born wildebeest calf tries to struggle to its feet to suckle immediately after birth. If it fails to do so, it'll probably fall victim to predators. Wildebeest live in large herds, and it is obviously important that the mother learns to recognize her offspring after birth. She licks her calf and learns to recognize its smell and the sound of its cries. But this learning ability is only restricted to the first 5 minutes after birth. If she's separated from her calf during these vital minutes, she will always reject her offspring in the future and refuse to suckle it. The young calf learns to recognize its mother in the same way and always tries to keep up with her. This limited type of learning is often called imprinting. These goosander chicks are imprinted on the first moving thing they see, normally their mother. They learn to recognize her within the first day of hatching, and subsequently they will follow her wherever she goes. They'll even hurl themselves over a 60-foot drop to reach her. Luckily, they are well padded for a soft landing. Immediately, they make their way towards the river, where their mother is calling them to join her. They are already able to feed themselves, but they will stay with her for another month to learn the finer points of feeding. Birds which nest well away from predators produce young which are almost helpless, but the chicks have one innate response. They beg with a wide-open gape when the parent approaches the nest with food. As long as the gape is there, the parent will ignore all other clues and simply stuff the chick with food. This innate response to a begging gape is used by nest parasites to their own advantage. After heaving the dunnart's eggs out of the nest, a cuckoo chick presents a super gape, which the poor foster parent finds irresistible. She slaves tirelessly to feed the usurper. Perhaps if the dunnart had been able to include size as an additional clue to the identity of her own offspring, cuckoos wouldn't be around now. We all take it for granted that animals know what to eat. The hummingbird's choice of food is innate, because it's specially adapted to probe for nectar while hovering on the wing. It would only be worse off if it tried to feed on anything else. But for omnivores, such as baboons, there's a great deal to be gained from curiosity and trying out new foods. Young baboons learn how to manipulate food and what is edible by imitating their elders. As with humans, the older members of the troop tend to be more conservative, while young baboons are constantly trying out new objects for edibility. Perhaps that is how meat entered the diet of the whole troop. Learning gives baboons the flexibility to cope with sudden changes in the environment, such as drought. They can always switch over to another food. The baboons in this troop have learnt to turn over stones to search for termites. It isn't long before the observant youngster follows its mother's example. Many predators learn to pick out clues such as movement and color contrasts when searching for their prey. As a result, many prey insects remain motionless, breaking up their outline and blending in with the background. So this blue tit has to learn to look for new clues. It takes a long time to find the first camouflaged caterpillar, but once it's found one, it is able to spot others with increasing ease. The bird has got its eye in and learnt what to look for. But some insects have turned the bird's ability to learn simple visual patterns to their own advantage. These cinnabar moth caterpillars have acquired an unpleasant taste as a result of feeding on ragwort. Once a bird has sampled a cinnabar and rejected it, it'll always associate the color pattern with an unpleasant experience. The same principle of warning coloration is used by many other poisonous insects, such as the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly, which feeds on toxic milkweed. But warning coloration will only work as long as the predator can learn and remember a warning pattern. Many animals have to learn a new skill before they can feed successfully. Squirrels have to practice cracking open hazelnuts. But surprisingly, the squirrel's hoarding of nuts beneath leaves is under innate control. If a squirrel is given nuts away from its native woodland, it'll still go through the motions of burying them, carefully covering them with leaves and patting them down. The result is far from desired, but the squirrel is unable to alter its behavior to cope with the new surroundings. The Pacific sea otter collects abalones and sea urchins from the seabed. At the same time, it selects a small stone and carries it up to the surface. It uses the stone to smash open sea urchin shells laid across its chest. Now, this learned behavior has become almost universal among Pacific sea otters. These cheetah cubs may look as though they're just romping about aimlessly, but these chases actually involve many of the elements adults use when hunting. Play is rather like practicing for adulthood through fun and games, and most young mammals do it. By the time the cubs are nearly a year old, their mother may bring them a gazelle fawn to play with. The ability to chase and knock the fawn down is already there, but the cubs still haven't learned what to do with the fawn once they've brought it to the ground. With more practice and experience, they will soon be able to make a kill of their own. In Britain, blue tits accidentally discovered the cream in milk bottles when frost forced off the tops. A few birds learned that they could peck through the foil to reach the cream by peeling it back as though it was bark. The habit spread across the country as other birds imitated the pioneers until it became commonplace. Many birds are able to learn entirely new patterns of behavior. Marabou storks are normally only scavengers, feeding alongside vultures on a carcass. But during the dry season, such dense clouds of quelea and doves come to drink at the waterhole that the marabou only has to open its beak and charge, and some unfortunate bird will be bound to end up inside. It has learned the skills of a hunter. Japanese macaques have had to retreat to the harsh mountain regions of Japan to escape man. They've not only learned to forage for roots and berries beneath the snow, they've also learned to take advantage of the hot springs of the region. Japanese macaques are probably one of the few animals to take a hot bath, apart from man. It's now a part of their daily ritual to groom and bathe together in the steamy water. In other words, it has become part of their learned culture. Learning can also involve the suppression of innate behavior. Like most wild animals, these great white pelicans once feared man and avoided him. But continual exposure to the fishermen has taught them that they can come to no harm. In fact, there are distinct advantages in keeping as close to the boats as possible. This eider duck is trying to draw the intruders away from its nest by pretending to have a broken wing. But the people aren't interested in the birds or their eggs. All they want is the warm down that the eiders use to insulate their eggs. But the eider still persists in its wing display. This actually makes it easier for the down collectors. Most defensive behavior, such as the eider's wing display, is innate because flight is only effective if it is fast. An innate response is far more likely to guarantee a quick reaction than a learned one. Astonishing migrations are found throughout the animal kingdom. Every 2 years, these green turtles migrate several thousand miles from their feeding grounds off the Brazilian coast to lay their eggs on Ascension Island. Ascension is a mere dot in the ocean, yet they not only manage to locate it, they also succeed in finding the very beach where they themselves hatched out 20 years before. It's believed that they find their way by being imprinted on the taste of the water around Ascension. Once the female has laid her final batch of eggs, she returns to the sea. The young turtles hatch out almost 2 months later. It's vital that they emerge at night. Daytime temperatures would kill them. This is ensured by very simple innate behavior. If the turtle encounters sand above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, it stops moving. This will only happen during the day. At night, the temperature of the sand falls, and the turtle is stimulated to crawl upwards until it breaks through the surface. The next problem for the hatchlings is to find their way down to the sea in the dark. It's believed that they are able to distinguish a paler band of sky above the sea because it acts like a huge mirror, reflecting any light. It is an innate response which causes the turtles to head towards the light and the sea. Equivalent navigation skills are also found among many insects. This Bembex wasp has the non-stop task of feeding her grubs within their tunnel nests. Each time she leaves a nest, she carefully closes it up again so that it becomes invisible. Then she hovers and circles over the nest for a few seconds, memorizing all the landmarks, such as blades of grass or stones. When she returns with a paralyzed fly, she finds the burrow by recognizing the same landmarks. Bembex's tunnel seems relatively simple when we start to compare it with architecture as complex as a spider's web. When a spiderling builds its first web, it is perfect. The spider has nothing to learn, for the entire process is under innate control. The precise building behavior of bees is also mainly innate. The bees are so accurate that different individuals can work on separate parts of the comb, and when all the sections finally meet up, they will match perfectly. Each bee carefully checks every angle so that it measures exactly 120 degrees and tests the thickness of the walls to within 1/100th of a millimeter. This is another digger wasp called Sphex. Like Bembex, it lays its eggs in tunnels in the sand. But instead of continually refilling the nest, Sphex stocks it with paralyzed prey only once, and then she closes the tunnel for good. After filling it with sand, she tries to block the tunnel with stones. She's very critical of her work. The stones must fit exactly. Her choice of stones is based on learning by trial and error. At last she's satisfied with her masonry and vibrates her body against the top stone to shake down the sand grains and fill in the cracks. This part of her behavior is believed to be innate. When a young masked weaver builds its first nest, it certainly isn't perfect. The bird has correctly chosen green flexible grasses and split them, but it still has a lot to learn about weaving. It's as though the bird has a blueprint of what the final nest should look like, but lacks the practical experience to achieve it. The weaver bird doesn't require a teacher, it just needs practice. Each stage of nest building automatically stimulates the weaver to move on to the next stage. The final result is recognizable as a masked weaver nest. It's just a bit more untidy than most. These more experienced birds are making a much neater job. It's important that the young weaver should learn quickly, for the male's success at finding a mate depends on his skills as a nest builder. But when man builds, his behavior is guided entirely by skills and knowledge that he has learned. Different cultures and even individual architects build in a variety of styles throughout the species. There is no blueprint. Probably one of the oldest questions concerning learning relates to bird song. Do songbirds have to learn what to sing, or do they know it from the moment they leave the egg? It seems that both learning and innate behavior are important. Many young songbirds must be exposed to the adult territorial song within the first 90 days of hatching, the so-called sensitive period. During this time, the bird will assimilate a crude outline of the song, but it will not sing at this stage. It's only during the following spring that the bird actually practices the song and develops the detailed trills and embellishments which sound so familiar to us. Every species learns a slightly different song, though some, such as jays and starlings, can learn and mimic the calls of another species. Apart from these exceptions, a bird's song is consistent enough to allow us to identify the species, such as this sedge warbler, by its song alone. But no animal behavior is as static as it seems. Even this potter wasp, building its mud nest, must be able to adapt to a constantly changing world.
The buffalo is one of the classic mammals of North America. Once upon a time, 100 million buffalo roamed the prairies. That was before the pioneers and cowboys like Buffalo Bill conquered the American wilderness and decimated the herds. Another of the animals which one associates with North America is the beaver. Like the buffalo, the beaver has had more than its fair share of persecution, mainly from fur trappers, but it does have protection now. The moose is a third classic American species. Moose is North American Indian for wood eater. However, it may surprise you to know that neither the moose, nor the beaver, nor the buffalo was originally an American animal. They came from another continent, thousands of miles away. The history of the buffalo, the beaver, and the moose began in Europe and Asia. They first evolved here. One of the reasons that this isn't widely known is that there is only one place today in Europe or Asia where all three exist together. It's a place where a buffalo is not a buffalo, but a bison. The European animals in question aren't at all numerous, and they exist together in just one small region, behind the Iron Curtain. The bison, the beaver, and the moose live in a primeval forest in Poland called Bialowieza. Biał means white, and Wieża means tower. In medieval times there was said to be a white tower in this ancient forest, which straddles the Polish-Russian border. Most of Europe was once densely forested. Then man moved in, and he quickly discovered that growing crops and husbanding domestic animals was a more certain and profitable existence than hunter-gathering. The forest was cleared to make way for a great monotony of fields. In some cases, man's influence has been beneficial to wildlife species. White storks nest on towers and chimneys. They forage in ditches and fields. Animals that favour open spaces haven't done too badly, but for the wildlife that depends on the deciduous woodland, things have gone from bad to worse. More than 95% of the old forests have disappeared, and fragments of it are few and far between. Bialowieza in Poland is one such stand of trees, and amongst the trees, some of the last free-living bison in the whole of Europe and Asia. They're beasts that seem to belong to some prehistoric era, and so they do. The bison family has lived in Europe for several million years. The European bison is majestic and powerful, and, weighing up to a ton, is the largest land animal in Europe today. The bull bison is larger than the cow, with thicker horns and a thicker mane of hair on its head and hump. They're animals of thick forest, but do venture out into the forest clearings. In this ancient Polish forest, there are many flowers that are uncommon in other younger European and Asian woodlands, like Siberian iris, wood cowwheat, marsh geranium and dyer's greenweed. But equally remarkable about the forest is the way that the trees seemingly go up forever. The trees are never cut down, and they can grow up to 160 feet high. There is a great range of species: oak, ash, birch, hornbeam, lime, Scots pine, spruce, and rowan. The bird life tends to be up in the crowns of the trees. A golden oriole. Lower down, a thrush nightingale. And below, the statuesque bison. Bison are members of the cattle family, but they are not the ancestors of domestic cattle. It was the wild ox, or aurochs, which was tamed and domesticated. This species became extinct in 1627 in the wild, though its domestic descendants lived on, of course. The large size and strength of the adults protected the bison groups very successfully against predators until the arrival of man. Then they were hounded out of Europe's forests by the tree fellers and hunters. It was only in northeast Poland that one or two groups survived into the 20th century. In 1914, there were just 400 European bison left in the wild. Then, in the violence of the First World War, soldiers and poachers shot every one. But fortunately, some bison had been sent to zoos elsewhere, and in the 1930s, several individuals were reintroduced. If the bison family's long and checkered history began in Europe and Asia, then there is still the question of how the bison's close relative, the American buffalo, got to America. The answer lies in the frozen north. Over the last 10 million years, there have been numerous ice ages. During ice ages, large quantities of water that might otherwise be in the sea are locked up as ice in glaciers. Today, America and Russia are separated by the waters of the Bering Straits. But during the ice ages, with so much water locked up as ice, the level of the sea fell, exposing the ocean floor across the Bering Straits between Asia and America. This process happened several times. Across the great land bridge of Bering, as it was called, walked a host of Asian and European animals, including at different times the bison, the beaver, and the moose. And this was how they colonized America. The Bering land bridge emerged and submerged on a number of occasions, but it last submerged 10,000 years ago when temperatures increased and much of the glacier ice melted. sea level rose and the Bering Straits were filled with water. The bison cut off in North America are still very similar to the European variety. The term buffalo should never really have been used. The word buffalo actually describes the African and Indian buffaloes, which look much more like cattle and lack the characteristic massive head, neck and shoulders of the bison. While the European bison is primarily a forest dweller and browses on trees and shrubs, the American buffalo is a grazing animal of the plains. When the buffalo reached the great American prairies, there was no stopping them. A few became millions. Then man arrived and began to hunt this sea of meat. The American Indians, who had acquired horses from the Spanish conquistadors, developed a whole way of life which depended on buffalo meat and skins. They used to drive the buffalo over cliff edges to kill them in large numbers. But it was the European cowboys who really destroyed the American buffalo. Armed with rifles, they killed 30 million animals. By 1903, there were just 21 wild buffalo left. Like the European bison, the American buffalo had to be rescued from the brink of extinction. It was President Roosevelt himself who created their first refuge in 1905. Today, in several national parks, the buffalo are beginning to be as thick on the ground as they once were of old on the prairies. In Custer State Park, the herds are now so large they're beginning to overgraze the area. In some years, the buffaloes have to be rounded up and animals translocated elsewhere. Stampeding buffalo are almost impossible to control. In the old days, while the West was being won, big herds of buffalo knocked whole railway trains off their tracks. When the buffalo are rounded up, they're given a health check and inoculated against disease. Some of the calves will be shipped out to help establish new herds, but the great majority of buffalo are released back to roam the prairie land. Like the cowboys, they've come a long way from their European origins. The rivers run slowly through the ancient forest of Bialowieza in Poland. That's partly due to the flatness of the Central European landscape, but there's another factor involved. The beaver family first evolved in the old world of Europe and Asia. Today's descendants are the largest rodents in the continent, and they're some of the most skillful engineers of the natural world. They build dams across rivers to make a protective moat around their island castles or lodges, which they also construct. Once the beaver lived in almost every European country, including Britain. Over the centuries, the fur trappers and foresters, dismayed at the tree damage, have destroyed the beaver in all but 7 European countries. Like the bison, the beaver family crossed the land bridge from Asia to America. And this tells us that the land bridge of Beringia was not just a featureless raised seabed, but that it was at one time covered with trees. For no beaver ever survived without a diet of wood. To be precise, the beaver does not eat wood, it eats bark. For it is in the bark layer that the protein and nourishment lies. But the wood is useful for building, and to transport it to the lodge, the beaver often excavates a system of canals. Inside the lodge, the female suckles her young. The combination of skillful workmanlike hands and chisel-sharp teeth enables the beaver to build almost anything with wood. The lodge is ingeniously constructed with impenetrable walls of logs. The exits are underwater, and this stops predators coming in to take the young. Scientists have been looking to see exactly what it is that makes beavers build dams. And they have discovered that a beaver will generally build a dam where it hears the sound of running water. They found this out by playing tape recordings of a trickling stream by a beaver dam. The result was that the beavers built their dams higher and higher, with mud and logs and stones, and seemed set to go on forever, until one beaver had the bright idea of covering the scientist's loudspeaker with mud. Beaver dams have a considerable effect by creating large areas of marshy swamp. And in the thickets close by, you can find the largest species of deer in Europe, an animal second only in size to the bison. The elk is almost the same size as a horse. It may have originally evolved in Central Asia and then spread westwards to Europe, including Britain, and north to Scandinavia. The elk then moved east to America, where it is known by its American Indian name of moose. The elk is highly mobile and can run at up to 50 kilometers an hour. But at this precise moment, the bull elk are in the process of the rut. Walking slowly and stiffly indicates aggression to a rival. Elk also thrash bushes and trees during the rut. When night falls on the forest, the smaller mammals emerge. A hedgehog searches for insects on the forest floor. A polecat looks for prey. Many of the mammals of the deciduous forests of Europe never made it to America. The climate along the way was just too extreme, and the forests of the Bering land bridge were largely evergreen pines and spruce, and unsuitable. The polecat and the hedgehog didn't make it, and neither did the wild boar. Wild boars depend on deciduous woodland too, though they're very adaptable within it, eating anything from truffles to dead rats. They're looking for acorns and tubers here, and plough up the forest floor in the process. When snow covers the ground in this part of Poland, The bison often move out of the forest onto the surrounding farms in search of hay and beets. Hunger drives the bison unusually close to the farm buildings. They're often joined by families of wild boar. The bison are totally protected animals, but there's a limit to the amount the farmers can be expected to tolerate. So the Polish bison guards put out hay to keep the animals in the forest. More importantly, providing hay stops the bison eating bark and saplings, and so prevents the destruction of trees. For the forest is really too small to sustain several hundred bison through the winter. Gone are the days when the great herds could roam throughout the forests of Europe. Large mammals have to be managed if they are to survive. It is during the winter, when the bison get used to the forest guards' comings and goings, that the Polish scientists carry out part of their field work. This involves darting the bison with a tranquilizing drug. It takes a minute or two for the tranquilizer to take effect on such a large animal. The idea is to make this bull identifiable as an individual to the scientists later on. He's marked in 3 different ways.
Ten Stefan to panikę sieje. Nie, ale jak to fajnie wyglądało.
First of all, an ear tag is attached. Then the number is branded on, using a harmless freezing technique. The branding iron is dipped into liquid nitrogen. Finally, the bison is put on the air. A battery-powered radio transmitter and collar are fitted. The scientists check that the collar is secure, but not too tight. It'll transmit for the life of the battery, which is about a year before replacement is necessary. The point of the operation is to follow individual bison throughout the seasons and to answer questions like, how large is a bison's range? Do bison move at night? Is a bull bison solitary or sociable? Once the antidote has been given, the bison will begin to reveal the details of its private life to the Polish scientists. It seems none the worse for the experience. Now the bison is on the air, it'll be possible to track it through the forests of Poland. Bison have even been known to push their way through the border fences into Russia. For us, the answer to the question, when is a buffalo a bison, is when it's in Poland. For the Poles who preserve this ancient forest, the answer is that a buffalo can never be a bison. For them, the Polish bison is unique, an important link with the prehistoric past.